Okay, our fourth lesson is about trade. So far in this unit, we've talked about the very basics of economics, economic systems, and production possibilities frontiers. We're going to finish up this unit by talking about what is really a two-part lesson on the importance of trade. Now, I know this all seems a little bit disjointed, but I promise as we go along, this is all going to eventually start to tie together. So let's start talking a little bit about trade. So why is trade important, and should nations trade with each other in the first place? And when you think about it, at first that seems like a hard question because there's lots of people and lots of reasons that we don't necessarily like trade, or that some people feel they don't like trade. Some people just like the idea of being independent. Some people like the idea that they can produce things on their own at home. We see that sign Buy American, right? It feels good to know we made something here at home. It protects jobs at home, right? If we buy American cars, then we're more likely to have American car factories up and running, hiring American workers. Politics very often gets involved. It's very easy for a politician to defend, again, a car manufacturing plant in Detroit, as opposed to saying that it's better to buy cars from Japan. Even if sometimes it is. We'll talk about why, but politics can definitely get in the middle of things here. Probably a little bit of ethnocentrism, and for those who don't know what that means, it's really the idea of that your culture is the best. We all have that bias. We all have that tendency to think that because it's our things and it's our way of doing things, it must be the best. And a very good reason to be concerned about trade is the idea of human rights. We've all heard the stories about children or workers being treated unfairly in other countries. But for all of those things, even that last one, human rights, the question I want to ask throughout the course of this lesson is trade really the problem there? Or is trade ultimately going to create more good than it does harm, any of those things we just talked about? For economists, the answer is definitely yes. But the question is why? And to understand that, we sort of need some definitions to get going. First, let's start with what we call an absolute advantage. Okay, an absolute advantage is the ability to produce a good using less resources. Or a lot of times we could just say that somebody is better at something. So if I gave two people two piles of pencils and said, write as many essays as you can, if one person came out with more essays, we would assume they were a little faster at writing essays. That's called having an absolute advantage. In other words, usually you're just a little better, a little faster, a little more efficient at using your resources. There's also, however, another definition called a comparative advantage. And that's when one country or person can produce a good at a lower opportunity cost. In other words, it's when one person gives up less to produce a good than another person. Which one of those is more important to economists? Well, it turns out it's the second one, but a lot of times we feel like the first one, the average person might feel like the first one is more important. Let's see why comparative advantage is more important than absolute advantage. And to look at that, let's think about Michelangelo. All right, we all think Michelangelo is one of the greatest painters in history. And my question is, if that's true, should Michelangelo hire someone to paint his house? Now again, what we don't want to do here is confuse these two advantages, comparative advantage with absolute advantage. Okay, Michelangelo might have been the best painter in history, and I'm sure he'd do a great job painting his house. So therefore, Michelangelo probably has an absolute advantage in painting his house. He's probably the best at it. But he does not have a comparative advantage, because when he paints his house, he is giving up a lot of time creating masterpieces, which are worth lots of money. So yes, he might be the fanciest painter in the world on his house, but it makes a whole lot more sense for him to hire somebody to paint his house so he doesn't waste time away from creating his beautiful masterpieces. Economists want people who have comparative advantages, therefore, to be the ones who produce things. And this is something I would definitely write down. Countries or people with a comparative advantage, or in other words, people who give up less, should produce a good, and then if things work well, trade it with someone else in exchange for something they do not have a comparative advantage in. What I'd like you to do now is stop the video, go back to the course homepage, do the worksheet on the Hatfields and the McCoys. Let's see if even the Hatfields and the McCoys, through trade, can get advantages from each other. Check your answers on that worksheet, and then continue the video from there. Okay, let's do an example together to try to practice. Okay, let's do an example together to get some practice. Let's take a piece of information here. All right, so here we have a little chart. And what is this chart telling us? That the United States can use its resources to either produce 5 pieces of cheese or 10 pieces of pie. And with those same resources, France could produce either 2 pieces of cheese or 8 pieces of pie. Now, the first question we're going to ask is who has the absolute advantage? In other words, using those resources, who can produce more? Well, obviously, in this case, the U.S. has the absolute advantage in both because it can produce 5 pieces of cheese as opposed to France's 2, and it can produce 10 pieces of pie as opposed to France's 8. So it definitely has, the U.S. definitely has the absolute advantage in producing cheese and pie. We might say they're the Michelangelo of producing cheese and pie. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they should produce both, and that France won't benefit and the United States won't benefit by trading. Because what haven't we calculated? We haven't calculated the comparative advantage. Now remember what comparative advantage is. It's finding out who has the lower opportunity cost to produce a good. Why don't we start by finding out who has the lowest opportunity cost for producing cheese? And the easiest way to do this is to make sure that we create a ratio where we can easily compare both countries. What's the easiest number to start with? In my opinion, it's always 1. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a 1-to-1 ratio for both countries. Meaning this, watch. Right now I see that for every 5 pieces of cheese, the US gives up 10 pieces of pie. Well, it's pretty easy to see that's also for every 1 piece of cheese, it's 2 pieces of pie. But if you can't see that, let's take a look. I want to be able to easily compare how much each is giving up compared to the other one. So to do that, I divide this number by 5 to give me a 1. But if I divide one side of a ratio by 5, I have to divide the other side by 5, which equals 2. Now, as you can see, 5 to 10 is really the same thing as 1 to 2. But now, watch this. If I do the same thing with France, I divide this side by 2, again, to give me a 1. And I divide this side by 2, again, that gives me a 4. Now, I have a ratio that's easy to compare. 2 to 8 is the same thing as 1 to 4. Now, what do I have? For every 1 piece of cheese, how much pie could I have produced? 2, it looks like. So the opportunity cost of producing cheese for the United States is 2 pieces of pie. And over here for France, for every 1 piece of cheese it produced, how much did it give up? 4 pieces of pie. There we go. Okay. So, who gave up more to produce cheese? Well, it looks like France gave up more. They gave up 4 pieces of pie. So what does that mean? It means that the U.S. has the comparative advantage in producing pie. Let's do another example. I'm sorry, the U.S. has the advantage in producing cheese, and therefore it should make cheese. By the way, we don't have to do this all over again, but we know that when one country has the comparative advantage in one of the goods, the other country always has the comparative advantage in the other good. But let's just see if that actually turns out to be true. Here we go again. Instead of this time doing cheese, the opportunity cost of cheese, let's do the opportunity cost of pie. All right, so I need to know for every 1 pie, how much cheese do you give up? Well, for 1 pie, I look like I gave up a half a cheese. And in the US, and for every pie in France, it looks like I gave up a quarter, that's not a very good quarter, there we go, a quarter of a piece of cheese. So again, for every 1 pie, I gave up 0.5 pieces of cheese. And for every 1 pie, I gave up 0.25 pieces of cheese in France. Who gave up more? The US gave up more to produce pie. They gave up a half a piece of cheese. France only gave up a quarter. And therefore, who has the comparative advantage in producing pie? It turns out it is France. And therefore, they should produce the pie. By the way, you might have noticed that it was actually the opportunity cost of pie was the reciprocal, if you know what that means, of the cost of cheese, and that's true. Okay, let's do another example. Okay, for the second example, I'm actually going to back up here a little bit and pull out to the not display screen, but it's easier for me to type in the answers here, so I'll work this way. Hopefully everybody can see okay. All right, so the question now is we're going to try a second example, number 2. And in this example, we have, again, a similar table, country X and country Z, and they can produce with the same resources pencils and pens, or pens, I should say. So country X can produce 2 pencils or 4 pens. Country Z can produce 3 pencils or 9 pens. We're going to answer each of these questions. Pause the video after each question, take a moment, figure it out for yourself, and then push play and get the answer. So question 1, who has the absolute advantage in pencils? The answer, in this case, is country Z. How do I know it's country Z? Because they can produce 3 pencils instead of 2 from country X. Who has the absolute advantage in pens? Again, it's country Z. How do I know? Because pens, Z can produce 9, country X can only produce 4. So again, going back to our other example, country Z must be the Michelangelo of stationery here. They can both produce pencils and pens better than country X can. But it doesn't mean they have a comparative advantage. Let's find out. Who has the comparative advantage in pencils? All right, to figure that out, we want to know who has the opportunity cost, or what is the opportunity cost of pencils. Okay, well, it is. Let's find out. In order to figure that out, we need to set up that 1-to-1 ratio again. So we're going to divide this side by 2, which will equal 1. And then we're going to divide this side by 2, which will equal 2. Again, 2 to 4 is really the same thing as 1 to 2 when it comes to comparing the two things. We'll do the same thing for country Z. We're going to divide both sides by 3. And when we do that, we find that now we have a pencil with 1, a pen to 2 for country X. Excuse me, for every 1 pencil, country X gives up 2 pens. So the opportunity cost of a pencil is 2 pens. And for every 1 pencil country Z produces, it gives up 3 pens. Who gives up less to produce pencils? It looks like country X. And so who has the comparative advantage in producing it? It would be X. Now we know, by the way, from what I said a few minutes ago, that if we did our math, we'd find out that the other is also true. It must be that if country X has it in pencil, country Z has it in pens. And then lastly, what would be a good plan for trading between country X and Z? Okay, since country X has it in pencils, X produces pencils, and since Z has the comparative advantage in pens, Z would produce the pens, and they would trade. Okay, pretty straightforward. Now, is there another way that we could actually look at this whole thing? Well, it turns out there is. We could also look at this from the point of view of a PPF. Let me blow this back up for a second. There we go. This is the lovely town of Oinkville and Pigtropolis, and these are their PPFs. Now, we've already done PPFs, and this might not look like the easiest thing to turn into a comparative and absolute advantage question, but the easiest thing to do is simply out of this information to create a chart similar to what we've been creating, something like this. Take a look at what it says. It says that Oinkville, if it produces all ham, there we are, there's all ham, produces 200 ham, and if it produces or all the bacon it can produce, it could produce 400. Pigtropolis can produce 100 pounds of ham or 300 pounds of bacon. And all I've done is taken that information and put it into this nice chart. So now we can move on and get rid of this PPF. But questions could be presented either way, either in words, with a chart given to you already, or sometimes in the form of a PPF. Any one of them, though, will work fine as long as you can convert it into a nice clean chart. Okay, so now that we have our chart, we're going to answer the same battery of questions. I'm going to put them all up here for you. And what I'm going to ask you to do is stop the video now, answer all 4 questions, and then we'll come back with the answers in just a second. Okay, hopefully you're ready for some answers. Here we go. Again, I'm going to escape out of this and keep my screen so it's easier for me to type. Who has the absolute advantage in production of ham? Well, again, in this case, it looks like Oinkville can produce 200, Pigtropolis can only produce 100, and so it is going to be Mr. Oinker. Who has the absolute advantage in the production of bacon? Again, Oinkville can produce it more than Pigtropolis can, so therefore it again is Oinkville. Who has the comparative advantage in ham? Well, again, we don't know that, so let's look real fast. What is the opportunity cost of ham? It is either 1 ham to every, or, again, dividing both sides by 100. Looks like it's going to be a question of for every 1 ham that Pigtropolis is giving up 3 bacon. And for Oinkville, for every 1 ham it produces, it's going to be giving up, looks like 2 bacon. And so the question is, who has the comparative advantage in ham? Who gives up less? In this case, it's Oinkville again. And so Oinkville would be the one producing the ham. Who has the comparative advantage in bacon? Well, it must be then Mr. Pigtropolis. There we go. And lastly, who should import the bacon? That's kind of a twist on the question. Well, who's producing the bacon? The bacon is being produced by Pigtropolis, so who needs to bring it in? In that case, it would be Oinkville. Okay. Do some more practice problems online and keep at it.